Let me use the opportunity to talk a little bit about tax compliance and an experiment that I ran with some of my co-authors in Philadelphia, trying to help the city of Philadelphia to improve property tax collection. So as you know, tax compliance has become a pretty substantial policy issue, not just in the US and municipalities in the US, but of course also in Europe, particularly. Not only are we Germans world champions in soccer, as all of you know, but we're also world champions apparently in tax compliance. And our friends in Greece are not doing so well on the soccer field right now, but they're doing even worse in terms of tax compliance. Should they be concerned about this? Well, obviously, yes. If the government is denied the resources, then they cannot provide basic services. And we all know, we all believe that there are important services the government should provide. On top of that, if there's a significant amount of non-compliance, the people who actually do pay taxes, so those 27% in Greece who are currently paying taxes, they will have to pay much rather tax rates with all the problems associated with that, but on top of that also obviously non-compliance on a large scale completely undermines any kind of fairness that may have existed in the theoretical tax code, and as a consequence can really undermine the functioning of government and undermine the credibility of democracy. So each taxpayer basically has to ask himself or herself two questions, right? So the first question is, how much do I owe? And from the perspective now of the municipality or the government who is trying to run the tax code or is trying to enforce the tax code, there are a few options, and those make, I think, the use of certain types of taxes more desirable. And so since this paper is about the property tax, it's pretty hard to hide property. You cannot really ship it off to some tax haven abroad. On top of that, assessment of property values is pretty straightforward these days, given the kind of technology that we have available. Same is true, of course, for certain types of income taxes, value-added taxes, and to some degree I think that explains why we're using it. It kind of like minimizes the opportunity for taxpayers for underreporting their tax base, right? So the second question then a taxpayer should ask themselves is, what happens if I don't pay the taxes? Well, as you know, you all have paid taxes. If you don't pay taxes, what happens is that there is usually a complicated system of fines and penalties that start to accrue. And hopefully, Gary Becker tells us that as we're piling up the fines and penalties, we make non-compliance less desirable, and people will start paying their taxes. And in the worst case scenario, we will go after them, and we will either go after them at the sale of their property through a lien, or we will, if they don't sell their property, we have the option to foreclose on them through sheriff sales and things like that. Now, obviously, the problem of that is there are credibility issues here. There's a question whether there's political willingness actually to go through enforcing the fines and penalties. It could be extremely costly for the local politicians to do that, and it could be extremely costly for the local politicians to change the equilibrium, right? Once you're in a bad equilibrium in which people don't pay taxes, you need to get reelected. Might not be in your interest to change the equilibrium in the short run. On top of that, there is actually rather mixed empirical evidence regarding the effectiveness of these fines. So what can we do? Are there alternatives to basically the stick, right? Can we design maybe a softer system of incentives here that would provide a sufficient amount of incentives for late or maybe even delinquent taxpayers to at least contemplate paying some of their taxes? So what is there? So The more recent literature on tax compliance, as far as I understand it, then has kind of like focused on alternative motivations that may explain why some of you, or all of you, I hope, pay your taxes. Now, some of it has to do with the realization that without taxation, there's no civilization and there is no provision of public services. So this is basically still speaking kind of like strictly economic logic here, kind of like suggesting that you should pay your taxes, but there should be motivations, non-economic motivations, that may also suggest that it's a good idea to pay taxes. And usually the way we think about these is some kind of like appeals to civic duty, right? We believe that actually a lot of behavior that seems to be economically irrational, I think can be easily explained within a slightly broader economic framework in which you're actually endogenizing things like morals or rules and things like that. And then it can be, you can sustain often in these slightly more general models, cooperative equilibria in which people actually do the right thing and fulfill their civic duty. So, well, what can empirical researchers do here to add to our understanding? And I think that there is kind of like a new research evolving, which is trying to take some of these ideas that have come up in the theory a little bit more seriously and trying to see whether actually these kind of motivations and reinforcing these kind of motivations can actually account for maybe increasing tax collection, especially in communities, municipalities that have poor track records for collecting their property taxes. So that's how this all started. Actually, if I can digress, this is actually the best thing that has ever come out of me sitting on a university committee. As you know, these are dreadful experiences. But I met this guy, John McDonald, at this strategic planning committee, and we started to talk about research. And this is how this whole started, because he had been contacted by the city of Philadelphia. He had some good contacts in the Department of Revenue, and they had actually contacted, he's a criminologist, okay, so they were bypassing the economists here, okay, they went straight to the criminologists. And they had contacted him asking what can they do, what can the criminologists can do to help them redesign the letters that they send out to tardy or delinquent taxpayers. And then he came to me, the economist, and then we went to Bob and other people. And we started to bounce around some ideas, and that's how this experiment came about. So there was a lot of interest within the city of Philadelphia to improve a property tax collection. And so what kind of nudge strategies, right here, that's the way you should think about it, or notification strategies, what can we do here in order to help them? And historically speaking, I should say that property tax collection in Philadelphia is bad, right? Around 90% of assessed property taxes are only paid, well below average in the US. You can look at table 1 of the paper for, find your favorite city and then see how you're doing. Okay, so because there was a lot of interest on the city side, they promised to let us run some experiments here and to evaluate different strategies. I come back to that in a second. So as you can say, this is a standard letter you would get in Philadelphia if you are tardy. You can see a good lawyer, okay, cooked up this letter, okay. It has everything essential from a legal perspective, and it has nothing on it that might be economically interesting or relevant, right? It basically tells you how much you owe, penalties, fines, and so on and so forth, and then it gives you the contact information where to send the check, right? Okay, what could we improve? Well, I mean, hopefully we were hoping initially. What am I supposed to do here? No, okay, no, okay, all right, no. So we were, of course, hoping that we could directly change this letter. Needless to say, the lawyers told us no. And so what we did instead, we designed some stuffers. So basically a second page, and if you look to the back of the paper, you can see exactly the 4 papers. So we have 3 treatments, 1 control. You can see exactly the letters that we use. So we were basically adding a second letter to your standard reminder, and we changed the message, okay, that we were trying to communicate. And we made it such that if you opened the letter, actually, you would first read our letter, all right, and then you would read your tax bill. So what are the 3 letters that we designed? The first one was pretty much a straight up threat letter where we said, don't make the mistake of thinking we're not going to come after you, we will. The second letter was basically where we said, listen, here's all the great things we do for the community, please pay your taxes. And the third letter was basically reminding people that 9 out of 10 people in Philadelphia were actually paying their property taxes, so why not them? Okay, that was the strategy. Then we had a control letter, okay, because we were adding these stuffers and we didn't want to confound just the stuffing, the adding another letter with the treatment of receiving a message. And so the control letter, the 4th letter, is just like, you know, saying something that you should know anyway, please pay your taxes. So the experimental design, I don't know how much I should go into detail here. I don't know how much you guys care about this. We ran into basically 2 minor problems. First of all, because it was the first time we were running an experiment with the city of Philadelphia, and they had some constraints that we ended up, we didn't want to waste all our time arguing with them. And so we couldn't do straight randomization. But fortunately, what the city does, they have already basically what I would call a pseudo-random assignment of properties to billing cycles. And that's almost, as a matter of fact, they claimed they randomly did it, you know, way back when they had a guy who could produce random numbers for them. We checked it, and it looks pretty random to me, but obviously it's not ideal. Okay. The other thing I should say on the side, okay, so the stuffing occurred in the city of Philadelphia. And it's amazing what can go wrong, even with simple tasks, stuffing an envelope. And they managed to totally screw it up on 6 of the 15 days of the experiment. So if you look at some of our tables carefully, you will see some odd asymmetries in the sample composition, and that's exactly because the guys who are running the mail room, I don't know what the hell they were doing. Okay, so. Yeah, I really don't know. So, well, the good news is we were still left with roughly 4,900 people in our sample. The bad news is they were not equally assigned to the treatment and control groups. Also, there's one thing that I should know. Because it took us such a long time to negotiate, at some point we weren't even sure whether they still wanted to go ahead. That when came, because we wanted to do it before the new billing cycle starts in January. And so we were still talking to these guys in October. And they were still kind of like, you know, shuffling their feet. And so eventually then we managed to convince them at the beginning of November, we got the go-ahead. And then at that stage, unfortunately, 2/3 of the tardy letters had already assigned to collection agencies. So the sample that we have is not technically a random sample of the underlying population of tardy properties, because 2/3 of them, because these collection agencies, they don't randomly pick, they obviously pick the ones that give them the highest potential returns, and so we're left with the 1/3 that the city tries to enforce. And so, but nevertheless, it's still a perfectly interesting and legitimate exercise to do, even on that 1/3 of the sample. All right, so did we make money for the city? Okay, and I was really concerned about that, because, you know, I mean, I have tried lots of things and failed miserably many occasions. So, but at least here, it seems to me, if you crank through the numbers, just the raw numbers, and that's the beauty of running an experiment, it's not that complicated. Turns out, if you look at the last column here, I know these tables are awfully small, and if I had known this, I would have, anyway. If you look at the last column there, you see that the threat, our best guess, is generated around $10,000 over what the per day, I should say, per day. That's not the best measure. I will show you a better measure in a second. Okay, you add that all up, we generated $250,000 for the city. Okay, that's good. Okay, a better measure is, you know, because there were this unequal number of treatments in each treatment and in the control group is actually to look at the average payment per letter. Okay, that is, I think, the correct outcome measure, and that's in table 5 of the paper. And so if I ignore the difference between the 3 treatments, I get $174 for the 3 treatments together. In the full sample, I got $112 for the control group, so we kind of like raised $62, right? That's the difference in means by sending these guys these 3 different treatments. And if you decompose it down by individual treatment, then you find that we raised $90 on average in the full sample for the service treatment, $21 for the civic duty treatment, and $30 for the threat treatment. So, and it turns out no matter how we break the sample, so we have 3 different samples. We have the full sample, then we eliminate commercial properties, we eliminate properties with multiple owners. We always have positive treatment effects, so that's very reassuring. We did not lose money for the city, no matter what, no matter how you cut and slice the data, all right? The city is better off as a consequence of this experiment. Is it statistically significant? Well, yeah, well, that's unfortunately a tougher cookie, right? Because remember, 65%, 85% of these people on average do not respond, so there are 85% zeros in the sample if you look at the amount sent in, right? And so that means the variance, even in large samples, is very large. But the good news is that in our favorite sample, which I think, at least my favorite sample, I can't talk to Bob in my courses, but my favorite sample is the sample of sole owners, because that gets around the problem of having multiple property, or owners of multiple properties. In that sample, we actually do have a significant treatment for the moral treatment, and even the other 2 treatments, if you look at the T statistics, or you look at the ratio between the treatment and the estimated standard error, it actually doesn't look so bad, okay? So, all right. Now, the literature also looks at other outcomes besides the mean treatment effect, right? Because as I argued before, there are some values just of increasing participation in the process, right? You can say even if somebody only pays a few bucks, doesn't pay the full bill, at least that person shows that he still has some faith in the government, right? Whereas if he totally or she totally drops out, then, you know, that's worse, right? So that's why we look at, that's why we look at 2 different outcomes. So we look at the outcome whether you send anything in, so that's what we call ever paid. And then we look at this outcome that is similar to the total payment but does not have this variance problem associated with it. So we just look at an outcome which is a dummy, which is whether you paid in full or not, right? And it kind of like deals with the fact that different people own different amounts, right? So that's why people in this literature look at these 2 discrete outcomes. Then you can't say anymore how much money you generated, but you can find out by how much you increased participation. If you go back to table 4 of the paper, I show you exactly the different participation rates based on these outcomes, and then you can judge for yourself. So what do we find? We find actually that the appeal to civic duty here had overall the most significant effect on both participations, or whether you send anything in, and full, okay? The drawback of this is that the civic duty primarily worked on the size on the subsample of taxpayers that owed very little. Okay, so we had huge effects in the lowest quintile or quartile of the distribution. If you rank people by how much they owe, that's where the civic duty kicks in. So that's nice, and kind of like we get these people who don't owe much, they get this letter, they say, hey, you know, it's really the right thing to pay. These guys look at it, I owe 20 bucks, 50 bucks, $150. They actually are more likely to send it in. You send it to some notorious tax evader who owes tens of thousands of dollars, right? That guy's not going to change his behavior. That's exactly what we find. The thing that is maybe more surprising is the fact that, remember what we found is the provision, the service appeal was actually the one that raised the most money. And so when we kind of like break it down by types, we find that it is most effective when we look at the people who owe the most. And so to some degree that is a little bit astonishing, I think, and we need to do maybe think this through a little bit more, but that is something we also find, right? So the service appeal seems to operate, at least in this experiment and in this sample, seems to be more effective on people who do owe a lot of money. So let me wrap up. So I think that there is some value. I mean, actually, there is definitely value in exploring different nudge or notification strategies. And I do believe we have at least provided some evidence that these strategies have the potential to improve tax collection, not just in Philadelphia, but hopefully, I mean, I don't know how much we can extrapolate from Philly, but, you know, they should work in other scenarios for other cities as well. Now, one thing that comes out of our estimates is that, you know, not everybody responds the same to these nudges, right? Some people seem to respond stronger to civic duty. Others respond more to service appeal. And I'm sure there are people out there you can threaten. Okay, we haven't found them, but I'm sure they exist. And to some degree, our next experiment that we're contemplating right now will try to target these guys a little bit more carefully. So, but I think one thing that you can take away from this research is that, you know, there could be potentially large benefits from targeting. If you can figure out, right, you know, how people respond to different messages, then I think there could be some potentially large benefits from targeting. And so obviously we need to do a lot more research to exactly figure out how to do that, right? But I think that's kind of like a nice result that we get from this kind of work. So obviously, I think you all are hopefully paying your property taxes, and you may know people who don't. And so if you have any suggestions on how we can improve our strategies, hopefully we will be able to do more experiments here in Philadelphia. I think we did convince the people in the Department of Revenue that there is some value of doing this. And so if you have any, please let us know. Thank you.